This is Teresa Davis, your host of the Grief Mentor podcast. Welcome to Season 2, where together we will journey through the hardships that grief thrust upon us while holding on to the anchor that is trustworthy and true. Here you will find interviews and biblical truths that speak healing into the mind, body, and spirit of the brokenhearted. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the show, guys. This is Teresa Davis, your host. And the title of today's episode is, How Do We Measure Grief? This is the first question and answer episode of the new season. And today's question was submitted by Marti Jackson. It's a two-part question. Why do we measure grief? Either our own to others or undervalue others' grief journeys. And what truths do we need to know to stop this? Guys, wouldn't it be nice to have a way to measure the intensity of the pain we feel in our heart when we lose someone we love? Like a blood test that gives us a certain value, or be able to estimate intensity based on the amount of tears that we shed for the person we long for. There are many scales that measure intensity of grief. However, most of these scales all measure a person's subjective answer on how they cope or manage their grief. There remains no instrument that I was able to find to measure the intensity of the pain felt within the heart when we lose somebody we love. It's obvious to me, guys, that measuring grief is much like measuring pain. I'm an RN, and I was trained many years ago that pain is the fifth vital sign. Measurements like blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen concentration, or your temperature are all concrete numbers, but pain is very subjective and based on the person's perspective. I view grief in the same way. It's indeed a very personal experience. So how can we possibly judge another person's grief? Would I agree that the ability to manage our grief affects our ability to return to what's called a new normal, which I don't like that term because life will never be normal without my son in it. However, I do believe with the right tools utilized in our grief journeys, we can reach a place that I call a God-created space that we can learn to live life from again. Is it a different place? Yes. It's a place that we never expected to live life from. But here we are, guys. Tony and I co-facilitate retreats for bereaved parents, and we've heard many tragic stories. And I do believe that there are certain factors that can and do intensify grief. And one of those is death outside the natural order, or what we perceive to be out of the natural order. And that's when a child dies before a parent. Another factor that I believe intensifies grief is sudden death. A family has no way to prepare for sudden death. There's no opportunity to say goodbye. And often there seems to be no closure or finality about it because sometimes there is no body. There's no one to touch or to see, to say your last goodbyes. I believe caregivers have an intensity in their grief that can be heavy because they not only, especially if they're taking care of a loved one, not only are they grieving the loss of their loved one, but often their care becomes so much a part of their identity and who they are that it's very difficult for them when the person they're caring for that they love very much dies. I believe that death by suicide, especially death by suicide of your child, brings a very heavy layer of grief. The closeness of the relationship of the person that we lost definitely affects our ability to grieve. Couples that have been married 30, 40, 50, 60 years, they have become one. They often can't remember where their life ended and their spouses began because they've been together so long. And guys, let's not discount human connections that develop outside of what we consider to be family dimensions. However, that may be the only family that they ever knew. So even though they might not be a blood relative, their intensity of their grief will be the same as if it was a family member. I believe the degree of suffering before someone dies affects the intensity of grief. And now let's talk about grief, guys, that doesn't result from death. You've heard me say many times that grief has many faces. We suffer grief many times not connected to death, divorce, loss of relationships, loss of a childhood. I interviewed 2 ladies that you're going to hear this spring that lost their childhoods. One by a mother who was not able to emotionally connect to her daughter, who was also probably mentally ill, and another one who lost her childhood to sexual abuse. Not everyone has a Leave It to Beaver family. Some of you may not even know what I'm talking about, but Leave It to Beaver was a show that was popular in the 50s, and it depicted the perfect family. Some couples grieve the inability to conceive a child. There are many faces of grief. So to answer Marty's question of why do people elevate their grief above another, I believe Tom Gilbert's answer in the episode that we did on complicated grief is perfect for this situation. He explained to us that grief is something that is thrust up on us, something that is done to us. And I believe because of that, we turn inward, and our view reflects that. And we become very me focused and unable to see anyone else's perspective. The second part of Marty's question was, what truths do we need to know to stop this? I believe the best answer to that question is being aware of it or knowing about it is not the same as living it. And that is true for all types of grief. I'll give you an example. I once heard a well-known psychologist in an interview on the Larry King Live show speak about the death of his son. He had counseled many grieving parents over the years, and after his own son passed away, he called every one of those parents and apologized. Not because he had done something harmful or unkind, but he wanted to acknowledge to them that he had no idea of the depth of their pain until he experienced it. With that said, guys, the best approach is to never elevate your own personal grief above another, lest you find yourself in their shoes. Marty, thank you for your question and shedding light on a subject that is very much misunderstood. Would you like to have your question answered on the show? Reach out to me at the email in the show notes or on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. My handle is Grief Mentor, Teresa Davis. And that's all I have for you today, guys. So until next time, take care. If you enjoyed today's show, hit the follow button and scroll down the podcast page until you see the 5 stars and leave a review. Thank you for your support, as this will help the podcast reach those in need. If you would like to submit a question to have answered on the air, message me on social media or email me at the address found in the show notes.